Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are starting to cover the TV show Masters of the Air, which came out in 2024. It's available on Apple TV. We're going to cover the first 3 episodes today. Masters of the Air was created by John Shiban and John Orloff. It's based on the 2007 nonfiction book Masters of the Air, America's Bomber Boys Who Fought the Air War Against Nazi Germany by Donald Miller, as well as several memoirs, including A Wing and a Prayer, the Bloody 100th Bomb Group of the U.S. 8th Air Force in action over Europe in World War II, which came out in 1993 by Harry Crosby, and Red Tail Captured, Red Tail Free, Memoirs of a Tuskegee Airman and POW, which came out in 2005 by Alexander Jefferson and Lewis H. Carlson. It's considered a companion to Band of Brothers, which came out in 2001, and The Pacific, which came out in 2010. It's part of the whole HBO war, Hanks Spielberg juggernaut, and it follows the American airmen of the Bloody 100th Bomb Group throughout World War II. And we are lucky enough to have our usual SAS Rogue Heroes correspondent, George, on with us today. So welcome, George.
Thanks for having me to talk about not the SAS.
We'll find out if George knows about other topics. Spoiler alert.
Probably not.
Yes. All right. What did you guys think of this TV show, Mart?
I like Masters of the Air. When it first came out, I watched it immediately. I was very excited for it. But for me, this is one of these shows that needed to grow on me. So when I first watched it, I wasn't too sure about it. Now it's one of those that I tend to regularly go back to. So it's up there with the other two. I like the acting. It's a little bit more Hollywood than Band of Brothers and The Pacific, but I like it. I like the storytelling, even though it's a difficult topic to cover because so many people die and we lose so many characters and figures after an episode. But I think it's better watched as a whole than it is a separate episode, so it's an interesting one, definitely. I don't know if I have a favorite out of the three anymore. I just like all of them. So I'm excited to cover it. How about you, George?
Yeah, I mean, I was waiting for Masters for a good long while before it came out. Obviously, we were all sort of on tenterhooks, like, what is the next project? Oh, it's been announced. And then we were all waiting for months for any scraps of information. And I really enjoyed it, to be honest. I could see, though, where there were sort of some disjointed parts that I think I still wish were a little bit more joined up. I feel like it doesn't have quite the cohesiveness of the other two. And I'm going to say this now before Sam shouts at me. I really like Austin Butler. I've been an Austin Butler fan since 2016. It was really nice to see him do something like this. I had not seen actually quite a few of his really big films, like Elvis and Dune, but he was fantastic in this. So I really enjoyed that. And also for me, it was a really odd experience because where I am in the country is quite close to a lot of air bases. I know the landscapes and the areas in England that they were around. And so I've always grown up with this history in the back of my head. Bury St Edmunds, something that is a place that they've mentioned quite a lot in the books and things, is somewhere I've spent a lot of time just visiting. So it's a very interesting experience to have something that close in such an American production, if that makes sense. It doesn't quite hit the heights of the Pacific for me, but I do think it's a beautiful production.
Yeah. This morning, George was like, I'm going to talk about Austin Butler. And I was like, blocked. I don't really have beef with Austin Butler. I just find that when the show first came out, particularly, if you wanted to look at any content about Masters of the Air, you had to wade through so much Austin Butler shit. And I just got over it. I'm like, sorry, bud, I'm sick of you. I'm sure you're very nice.
Valid.
People were expecting him to be bad, though, and he's quite good. People were like, he's too Hollywood, he can't do it, but he's quite good.
Yeah.
To come back very quickly before we start to the disjointedness of the episode, I quite agree. Masters was originally meant to be an 11-episode run, and it's ended up being 9. So they had to cut a lot of storylines and shorten and
Streamline?
a little bit, yeah. So that might be one of the reasons. And also because it's a show made in the specific era of streaming. It's a different beast altogether, I think. So it's interesting to compare them to Band of Brothers and The Pacific, but it's a very different kind of show.
I will say, to me, it's the weakest of the three. I watched, I think, the first three episodes when they were airing, and then I sort of put it down and didn't come back to it for 6 months. And I do enjoy it now. I've seen it a couple of times, and there are definitely certain subplots that interest me quite a lot. We're going to talk about some lady spies later a little bit, and the Tuskegee Airmen, and I think all that stuff is really neat. I do think that topic-wise, Hanks and Spielberg are still coming back to this pre-9/11 World War II nostalgia shtick that they were doing with Band of Brothers. And I think at the time you could get away with doing a sort of like almost found family ensemble piece about a bunch of guys without really looking at any broader topics thematically. And then to come back 25 years later and do the same thing in a different context, I don't know if it 100% necessarily works, especially because the idea of strategic bombing was super contentious because now we know, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that there wasn't really any such thing as strategic bombing. They weren't that good at hitting their targets. In a lot of cases, it was carpet bombing. And there was a lot of arguing over whether or not that's ethical. And to not really touch on that, or to only touch on it really lightly and veer away from that and still focus primarily on the characters, I thought that made it weaker than it could have been. I would have liked to see that tackled a bit more. Even the themes around the Tuskegee Airmen, we don't really see too much about that. One of them just says something about how America's the better country of all the other countries. And I'm like, I don't necessarily think that was true for a lot of Black people living in America at that time. So yeah, they had the opportunity to touch on some themes and actually say something about them, and they didn't do that. So that's kind of why I think it's the weakest of the three. But all said, it's a very nice looking show. It's pretty well acted. Even if you're not super into World War II, I think you could watch it and get something out of it. So
I think it's really interesting because I think you're absolutely right about the mood that it evokes in this sort of found family-esque, I don't want to use the word glorification, but that kind of wholesomeness almost that band tries to reach for. And to put the Pacific right in the middle of that was what, 2010, 2011 that came out. So we had gone from a really heightened pro-war stance into, I think around that time, much more of cynicism to really interrogating. And I feel like the cultural mood is now shifting back into more of that sort of pro-war stance in some areas. So I find it very interesting to look at the three of them as almost like period pieces, not of the periods they're depicting, but of the time that they are made.
yeah, 100%.
I'll do one more closing argument in favor of the show, and that's for a show that spends a lot of the time in fake planes with masks on, they do pretty well. So I'm pretty impressed with that part of it. I thought it might be really boring to see people in planes all the time, but they make it really exciting. So that's a plus for me.
Yeah, I also think they spend a lot of time in the air doing shit that you really can't do as practical effects. There is going to be a lot of CGI, and I don't think the CGI is too bad.
No, agree, it's pretty good.
I mean, we don't have a bunch of B-17s to throw our actors into. That's just not a thing.
What did they only spend on this show? Like $100 billion? Like, what's a few more? Build some B-17s.
Let's get into the episodes. In episode 1, we meet John Bucky Egan, played by Callum Turner, and Gail Buck Cleven. They run out of nicknames in the 8th Air Force, played by Aston Butler. And these are our two main, I almost want to say main characters, but it's really an ensemble piece. And we meet them the night before Egan ships out, and he'll be air executive for the 100th Bomb Group in the 8th Air Force. And we meet them in a bar, and Cleven and Egan are very clearly mates. And Cleven is talking to his girlfriend Marge, played by Isabel May. It's a small role, but I still wanted to mention it for a second. And he's like, I'm gonna write to you when he ships out in 3 weeks. Egan reveals to Cleven that he'll be flying missions with the 389th. And Cleven is shocked by this because he wasn't supposed to be flying any missions. And he says, don't you die on me before I get there.
I think this is a great scene. I think this is a fantastic way to introduce these two characters who, you're right, they are two central characters of 4 central characters we realistically get. Even though it is an ensemble piece, we're really following these 4 guys. And even though not necessarily reflective of physically the real Buck And Bucky, I think we get their dynamics down really well. You've got Cleven, who's this wholesome, blonde, clean-cut guy who doesn't like to dance, and he's very soft with his lovely, beautiful blonde girlfriend. And you get Egan, who is dancing with one of Marge's friends he's met that day. He's going out there, getting all the adventure. That dynamic I really love. I will just read a really fantastic description of John Egan. It doesn't match Callum Turner physically, but vibes-wise, he nailed this. Major Egan was short and skinny as a stick, barely 140 pounds, with thick black hair combed into a pompadour, black eyes and a pencil-thin moustache. His trademarks were a white fleece-lined flying jacket and an idiomatic manner of speaking, a streetwise style borrowed from writer Damon Runyon, which is a very particular kind of New York style, which, if I recall correctly, John Egan had never been to New York. He just totally affected this accent. And they do nod to this later on in the series, I think it's in episode 3, where he's seen reading Guys and Dolls, which is a collection of short stories by Damon Runyon.
My favorite thing is that he's from like whatever the opposite of New York is, which is like a fucking backwater in Wisconsin.
Exactly. It's so great.
So after this nice, pleasant bar scene, we cut to John Egan in the thick of it. He's on his first combat mission, I think, over Wilhelmshaven, Germany on May 21st, 1943. And he immediately has to help a severely wounded crewmate. And I think it eats into his bravado a little bit. Initially, beforehand, he's like, oh, what's it going to be like? And then after, he's like, holy fucking shit. How am I supposed to tell everyone what that was like?
Mm-hmm.
They also show him being a really smart pilot because one of the engines is on fire and he has to put that out by having his co-pilot dive and feathering the propellers and all that kind of stuff. So they immediately show him being a leader in the air. It's quite a smart way to set up this first air scene. It's pretty exciting. You're like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah, it's nice to get some combat early on. You know, we got introduced to some characters and we kind of know their faces, and now we get what you come to a war show for.
Exactly. And after this, we go straight into the intro of the show. And I have some feelings about this because when I first saw it and when I first listened to the intro music, I didn't like it. And now it's one of my all-time faves. So it's moved up there really quickly. I think my favorite is still always going to be the Pacific. But I think after that it's this one, and then it's banned. So I don't know why I didn't like it at the beginning. I thought it wasn't catchy enough or something.
That was exactly what I was going to ask you, is what didn't you like about it?
I still skip it because I'm a hater, but it has grown on me a little bit. I like it better than I did initially.
Yeah, I really like it. I like Blake Neely. I think he's a fantastic composer who really understands the vibes of what he's trying to evoke. Whether or not I always agree with the choices of those vibes is a different question, but I think he really hit it with soul. And I do remember crying the first time I watched the intro, because they released it, I think, as a teaser, didn't they? And I did sob my way through it. I was like, I don't know who any of these people are, but I'm crying.
For those who don't know, Blake Neely also made the theme for the Pacific and the soundtrack for the Pacific. They're vastly different kind of soundtracks, which I kind of love. I do want to one day talk to Blake Neely and ask him what makes a good World War II soundtrack, because I'm sure there's things to watch out for, but
I was listening to a podcast with Blake Neely, and he said a couple of really interesting things. One, to make the comparison that you've just talked about with the Pacific, is that he said he would describe the Pacific theme as more of an elegy and this theme as more of a celebration. And I find that a really fascinating way of looking at these, basically a theme for two different collections of men. And I don't know quite how I feel about that, to be honest. I'm sitting in my feelings. What does that evoke to you?
is it playing favorites? Is it saying the air war is super heroic and the Pacific is all doom and gloom?
Yeah, see, I wonder if, again, it's like that more heroic wholesomeness. I keep coming back to this word, but that's the word I feel like it is much more than the Pacific, which is quite dirty and grimy, and it really sort of gets into the pain and the grimness in a way that I feel like neither Band nor Masters really does.
Yeah, I also think in the Pacific, it's perhaps easier to make it clear how futile a lot of things seem, you know, when they're taking over these little hunks of rock in the Pacific where nothing grows and no one would live there, or maybe like 12 people live there or whatever. And it's really just like so many people are dying here and for what? And I think that you get that message quite clearly in the Pacific that it's just an unimaginable bloodshed. In Masters of the Air, it's a totally different kind of warfare. They're not in any trenches, they're up in the air in these nice clean uniforms. And it's kind of what I said at the beginning, where I really don't think they leaned in hard enough to, yeah, they fought this war that was extremely bloody on both sides, the air war. And then I don't know truly how much it accomplished and what it was for in some ways, if you look at the ultimate results. But
It's difficult, isn't it? In some sense, I find it more horrifying than the war on the ground because it's such a gamble every time they get into one of these planes. It's a totally different beast, though. You're right. It's such a different way of thinking about the war, too, because there's no hand-to-hand combat. They don't even really see their enemy except the fighter planes. It's such a disjointed kind of warfare.
yeah, you're really separated from the killing in a way that you wouldn't be traditionally. We get a voiceover by a navigator, Lieutenant Harry Crosby, played by Anthony Boyle, and I'll just say I think his voice is delightful in this. A+ choice for a narrator. He lets us know that the 100th is sent to England in the spring of 1943, and we catch up with Cleven heading to Greenland in a B-17 flying fortress called Alice from Dallas. They have to stop in Greenland because they have to refuel on the way, and he's with co-pilot Roy Clater, played by Sawyer Spielberg. Yes, that's Spielberg. Also on this fort are Charles K. Bailey, played by Bailey Brooke, and William Quinn, played by Kai Alexander, who have been on the pod before. So go check out our episode about airmen who have been shot down, the Freedom Line. Yeah, so it's a little gusty on the landing, but yeah, they make it. We get introduced in this little interior bar scene to a bunch of different characters. I'll just run through them quickly because they'll probably surface again later. Everett Blakely, played by David Shields, Benny DeMarco, played by Adam Long, James Douglas, played by Elliot Warren, Howard Hambone Hamilton, played by Jordan Colson, Charles Crank Cruikshanks, played by Matt Gavin, and Joseph Bubbles Payne, played by Louis Greatorex. Yeah, we get introduced to all of these guys, which is really nice because I find this show does suffer a little less from all these white guys look the same.
Yeah, especially as well, they're all wearing masks all of the time. We really needed to figure out who on earth we are looking at any given moment. And I will introduce my pet theory that Masters chose actors with interesting eyes. Because if you look at them, they all have really beautiful, distinctive eyes.
I don't know if it was like the color mixing or what, but everyone's eyes are like, bam, especially when they're in the sky. Like blue eyes are like, holy fuck blue. And like brown eyes are really like big and clear. And I'm like, man, I wish my eyes looked like that all the time.
You should be on a Spielberg production. I'm sure they can make your eyes look like that.
That's what I need. Put me on a Spielberg production.
After we get introduced to them, we give a little bit and we go to East Anglia on June 8th, 1943. And we meet up with Egan again, and he wins. Is it darts that he's playing? I don't remember.
Well, he's not playing darts so much as he's doing something extremely foolish and someone else is playing darts.
Good point. But he wins a bike out of it, which he saves for Cleven. And he does this because they are at Thor Roberts Airfield, which is a big as airfield. So there's a lot of biking around to do.
Yeah, so on the way from Greenland to East Anglia, Crosby accidentally navigates his fort to occupied France, which is a bad idea. And so he's got this like terrible air sickness. He's throwing up, he's sick as a dog, and he accidentally directs them over occupied France. And by the time they get back to where they're supposed to land, they're low on fuel and their landing gear won't come down. So they have to make a belly landing. It's extremely dramatic. I really enjoy that scene. I've actually watched it a bunch, like independently of watching the rest of the episode. And what I find super interesting is that this story gets told by Donald Miller in Masters of the Air, but if you read Crosby's memoir, he doesn't really talk about it. It's like a one-line mention, and he's pretty good at being self-deprecating in the rest of his memoir, and he'll own up when he makes mistakes. I wonder if this one bothered him even 50 years later, if he really still felt a little bit guilty over this one.
I mean, navigating into France by accident is a bit of a big one.
Yeah, for sure. John Brady as a pilot, his plane was known as Brady's Crash Wagon because he had a couple of bumpy landings. They had crash landed in the mountains of Wyoming the year before during training. And Crosby said about Brady in his memoir, By now, we liked him very much. We owed him. If it hadn't been for him, we would have all been killed either in the mountains of Wyoming or on the first runway we saw in England.
That's great. This scene has the greatest line delivery I think Ben Radcliffe has ever given in his life. The son of a bitch, that's France line. I won't even try and do it because he does it perfectly. And there's a really beautiful moment where he's being incredibly competent and he's working this whole thing out. And then at the split second before they come down, he just looks like a little tiny scared boy.
Oh my God. The acting is really good. Yeah, I don't know if I said John Brady's played by Ben Radcliffe, and he does a great job. And then a couple minutes later, when they're on the ground, he's just so calm and chill. And he says my other favorite line delivery of this scene, which is, "You're a navigator, Crosby. You should be able to, I don't know, find England." And he just hits those D's so hard. It's very funny.
This show, for me, whenever you watch it again, you'll find another character to focus on, and they're all so good, and John Brady's one of those. Egan goes to the 100th CO, Colonel Hoagland, because he doesn't want to be air exec anymore, because he wants to be up in the air and flying. He's a flyboy, and at this point we notice that Hoagland, who doesn't want him to no longer be air exec, he is an ulcer, and I kind of put this in a note, and George was like, "I love how you make it sound like Egan is the one that gave him the ulcer."
Egan's probably is the one who gave him the ulcer.
Actually, that's really fair.
In a later scene, this ulcer actually bursts, and Hoagland is sent to London for treatment, and we get a different CO. The 100 goes through its COs pretty quickly.
Yeah, and some significantly distinct leadership styles, one might say.
Yep.
Yeah, so the first mission is the Bremen U-boat pens in Germany, and Clevin is flying with Curtis Biddick, played by Barry Keoghan, and the weather sucks. They're having a bad time. We get introduced to all the shitty things they have to deal with. Most of the damage to planes was caused by flak. I think I saw a thing where it was like 80 to 85%. So yeah, it was shitty dealing with fighter planes and it was shitty dealing with all kinds of other stuff. But really the flak was the real trouble when you were up flying in the air. So they're dealing with flak and frostbite and fighter planes. And once they get over the place where they're supposed to drop the bombs, they can't see it because the weather's so shitty. So they end up flying back to England without dropping any bombs, but they still lost airmen. And it just feels like why did we do that? Like, what was the point?
And I just wanted to quickly mention the music here, because the music for the takeoff scene is so great. And in general, I really like the takeoff scene because they take you through the pre-takeoff checks in the plane, and you really get to see everything in the plane and see the attention to detail they've got in the show. So I really appreciated that. And that is where the episode ends on this mission.
And as we had just seen Egan at a loss of how to explain to anyone how that went, we sort of get the mirror image scene of that when Clevin is like, "Well, why didn't you tell me?" And he's like, "What was I going to tell you? You've seen it now."
We pick up right where we left off in episode 1. For episode 2, we open at Thorpe during the interrogation, and it shows you how chaotic the interrogations are, because it's really difficult to pay attention when you're flying a plane and being shot at what's going on to the other forts around you, so I really like how they did that.
Can you explain what an interrogation is?
The interrogation is when they all get back from a mission, they're not allowed to talk about the mission until they've been debriefed and they've individually given their stories, because they have to match up what has happened in the air to make sure that all of that's as correct as possible, so they don't talk to each other before and kind of change their stories. I think it's meant to create not only an image of the losses but also of the successes, but mostly these are just really sad scenes, because it's a lot about how many parachutes did you see, and many times they didn't see any, so a lot of these people just went down or disappeared into a cloud bank.
I was reading about how this information often got passed on to the grave registration unit, which we've talked about before, and they would basically use the time. Like if someone were to say, "I saw this plane go down at 10:15, they'd be like, "All right, it was probably roughly in this area." And then that's how they would kind of triangulate where the body should be. And that's how they were able to find people and repatriate them.
That's pretty cool. I think the first record is the navigator's log, and then they try and piece it together from all the other testimonies. These scenes just make me really sad.
Yeah, so John Egan, he goes out drinking with Curtis Biddick, and he's up on the wing of a plane, and he's obviously not having a good time. He's talking about how he's not feeling anything, and he makes Kurt punch him in the face so that he can feel something. And I did enjoy this portrayal because I find there's elements, I think, later in the series where some of the things that he does can come off as selfish. And I liked seeing how deeply impacted that super hyper masculine, happy go lucky dude was by the things that had happened. And yeah, and your little note here, George, sorry to steal it from you, but yeah, he would write letters to all of the guys' families who had been lost, and these were not form letters. He was writing these heartfelt letters home to the families of these guys that he had known. So I think that he was a person who contained multitudes, and I really liked the inclusion of this scene.
I also think that Derek Keoghan is really in his element playing Curtis Biddick. One of the things when you read that Barry Keoghan is going to be in it, you think he's going to be in the whole show. He's going to be because he's Barry Keoghan. And spoiler alert, he doesn't make it for very long.
No, I do recall a lot of people being angry when he got killed off. And it's like, well, unfortunately, that's history.
So, with Haglin having his ulcer burst on the mission, we get a new CO, Colonel Chick Harding, and he's the one that tells Egan that he's no longer our executive. Officially, it's a demotion, but I don't think he feels like it's a demotion. So when he gets back afterward to Cleven at breakfast in the mess hall, it turns out that Cleven had actually talked to Harding before Egan got there and put in a word for him. And Jack Kidd, played by Edward Ashley, has been promoted to exec, but he's not very happy about it.
The 100th had a reputation for being shitheads before they ever got over to England. So when they were in the States, they were quite well known for like a pilot would just take his plane and like go and stop off and visit his girlfriend. You know, it just really was not very disciplined. And I think there was this sense that there can be a disconnect between how disciplined you are on the ground and in training versus once you're up in the air flying missions. But that's not really how it is, right? It's like if you want to be disciplined up in the air, you want these tight flying formations and you want people to know what they're doing, then you have to have this discipline on the ground. And so the 100th has a bit of a reputation. It's called the Bloody Hundredth, and they were known for being a bit hard luck as a unit. And I do think initially there was this very flyboy sense of devil may care that permeated the unit, and it was work hard, play hard, not so much of a focus on training and discipline. And I think that in some ways hurt them. And I know I'm not the only person to have said that. And as they proceeded through the war and they did change commanding officers, not just at the highest level, but further down through the ranks, as they unfortunately lost majors and other commanding officers, they did tighten up. And that did end up cutting down on their losses.
You do see that reflected in the series as well. Bubbles references Test Pilot when he's talking about Cleven and Egan. He's talking about like this stylish kind of flyboy glossiness that they've got to them. They're quite charismatic leaders of men and not necessarily sort of putting them in the same league as then somebody like Rosie, who comes along later. We'll talk about him in the next episodes, who is much quieter with his leadership. And you see that shift from that sort of movie star flyboyness to, I don't want to say dignified, but a quiet competency.
Crosby mentions it too, because Egan and Cleven were shot down within a couple days of each other, which we'll talk about in a future episode. But once they were gone, I mean, Crosby notes it. He's like, first of all, the loss of the two of them rocked the base because everyone looked up to them so much and they were really setting the tone at the top kind of thing. And once they were gone, there was this vacuum for people to kind of step in like Rosie, who were perhaps a little less showy and flashy and a little more focused on the nuts and bolts kind of stuff.
I also wonder if Rosie is more like that because the 100 had suffered so many losses at that point too, so they knew, oh shit, we really can't mess around, we have to be serious about this because we are losing so many men.
So we're progressing through time. It's July 1943. We get to know the ground crew, notably Ken Lemons, played by Raph Law. He's such a little cutie with his little curly hair. And we see him interact with some British kids who live near the airbase, which is also very cute. And then in the midst of this cute scene, they see a plane crash during a training mission. And you just see the looks on these two kids' faces. And you're like, oh, that's a really effective way to show how fucked up that is.
I think that happened a lot, right? They lost a lot of planes in just straight accidents, which is absolutely horrifying to think about. The guys that come all this way and then they didn't actually get to go, or they did. And there's one incident where a guy had completed 25 missions and was coming home, and at the last minute, he crashed. And so he just never got to go.
You have one enemy, and it's the Germans, but the other enemy is your own plane.
That's why I also like that we had an emphasis on the ground crew in this episode, even just to give us a little bit flavour of all of the work that they were doing to try and keep these birds in the air. Because can you imagine, you are the engineer, you are the mechanic, you are watching these guys go out mission after mission, and some of them don't come back. And so do you sit there and you think, could I have done something differently to have made the plane come back? And that must have taken such a huge toll. And I did want to note that Ken Lemons was 19 years old. That's a baby. That's a tiny little baby.
No, absolutely. I agree. And I think it's hard for us to imagine now, but really, this sort of air war that they were fighting, they didn't really have the technology to do it before the early 1940s. And then by the end of World War II, was already becoming obsolete. And so there's this window of time where they have this super new technology. They don't really have great strategies yet. It takes some time to figure out that they have to fly in formation. It takes some time to figure out that they need fighter escorts. It takes some time to figure out all these different things that make it safer. And then, of course, the technology is the same, right? It's like they're trying to get all these bombers up in the air, and there's all these moving parts, and it's pretty new technology. And so there's a lot of glitches. Things fall apart. They don't work the way they're supposed to. And when that happens, unfortunately, what are you going to do about it, right? You're 20,000 feet up in the air.
Right, and we'll talk about the reason why they're doing this, but as well, you have to remember that the ground crew are often working at night to be doing this. They would set up like little barracks out on the hard stands. They weren't going back to the central hubs. They were out there. They slept out there. That they, I think, would even eat out there. And they're doing all this maintenance work, so much maintenance work by torchlight. Britain was under blackout conditions, so they couldn't have lights to see. And if they needed it, they would have to construct makeshift shelters out of tarpaulins and things to try and fix these planes. It's horrific conditions that they're working under all hours of the night.
The 100 are having a really tough time. It's kind of illustrated in the show because they've not been in the war that long and they're already low on planes, and they've lost 66 airmen already out of the original 350 men that started out. So losses are very great.
Yeah, these B-17s have a combat crew of 10. So every time you see one of these planes go down and nobody make it out, that's 10 guys who just went out and didn't come back.
Split second, just gone.
Yeah. We get a little bar scene with the Brits and the Americans, which sort of gives us an idea of how differently the Brits and the Americans approached the air war. At the time, the Brits were predominantly bombing at night because they had started out bombing during the day and discovered that's a good way to get your ass shot out of the sky. So they started bombing at night. And of course, when you bomb at night, you don't really have a lot of precision. So they were pretty much just carpet bombing German cities. And the Americans were trying to do more precision bombing, which is a misnomer in some ways. But so the 8th Air Force had first begun combat operations in August of 1942, which is a year before. And when they came over, they had this piece of equipment called the Norden bomb sight, which cost $1.1 billion to make. And just to give you an impression, that's not that much less expensive than the atomic bomb. And it had been developed by Navy scientists in the early 30s and tested in the American West. And the problem is when you test a piece of technology in perfect conditions, you don't always get the impression of what it's going to be like when you are perhaps higher than you should be in the air because you're trying to avoid flak and you're trying to avoid fighter planes and the weather is garbage because it's fucking Europe in whatever season it is. And so they had these high hopes for improving the accuracy of bombings, but studies have revealed that as few as 5% of 8th Air Force bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the target. And the average error for 500-pound bombs dropped in Europe was a whopping 1,673 feet. So they were doing their best, I suppose, or they thought they were doing their best. But ultimately, even bombing during the daytime, they weren't necessarily always hitting their targets. So that's kind of where we're at. We're in this bar scene and we're getting these British airmen talking about if you guys flew at night, then few of your guys be getting killed. And the Americans are like, well, let's have a fight about it.
Yeah, it's Biddick who kind of takes on the fight again. Like Barry Keoghan has to be a boxer in this show. And he wins, obviously, because the Americans have to win. It's an American show. The portrayal of the RAF in this is debatable. I find that they're very harshly portrayed to be stick in the muds and they have a stick up their butts. I don't mind this as much because I'm not British, but I can understand the British not really liking this portrayal.
I mean,
I also, British soldiers were making significantly less money than the Americans. So imagine, if you will, all these people who are your allies come over. So you have to begrudgingly be like, thanks for coming. And they have tons of money. So of course, all of the local girls, they want to hang out with the flashy Americans that have all this money and not with you. So I don't think we could begrudge the Brits for being perhaps a little bit less than welcoming.
actually, I really love this because the Brits, and realistically, they're all, I think, English in that we see. They are so cartoonishly awful that I just sort of love it. It's like they've stepped out of fucking Blackadder or something. It's hard to be offended by that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too because they are having this conversation and the Americans don't really have a comeback. They don't really have a great response. And this is another opportunity that I think they could have taken to be like, yeah, this is why we're daytime bombing, so we can actually fucking hit targets and not, families. But they don't touch it too closely. I think there's a little bit of Harry Crosby voiceover about it, but daylight bombing was super dangerous. It did result in a high number of casualties. So I have a quote from the Donald Miller book where he says, in October of 1943, fewer than 1 out of 4 8th Air Force crew members could expect to complete his tour of duty, which was 25 combat missions. 2/3 of the men could expect to die in combat or be captured by the enemy. So yeah, flying daylight missions is a good way to get shot, and the Americans know it. And so I guess you can't blame them for being a little bit defensive on their end as well during this conversation.
The next mission they go on is Trondheim, Norway, and the target they have for this are the submarine plants there. And it's the mission on which Bubbles gets sick. So Crosby has to step in, and he's very late. He's very nervous. And he also has to lead the wing. It's trial by fire, I guess, for him.
Yeah, I love that he just shows up and you could tell that he has just clearly sweated through all of his underlayers of clothing. Fabulous acting job. I don't even need to see your clothes to know that you've sweat through them.
Bubbles also gives Crosby his little snow globe, and it's for luck. And also, poor Bubbles, he's very sick.
He's not having a good time. Don't worry, Harry's gonna get up in the air and vomit a bunch of times too. While they're up there, Biddick gets hit by flak and it really fucks up his plane. And Egan, as wing commander, decides they're all gonna stay with him, which is not a good idea. Strategic wise, you don't want your formation flying as slow as the slowest guy because it makes it easy to pick everyone off. But they know that if they leave him behind, then he'll be easy fodder for the Germans. And so that's why they do it. And Crosby basically has to navigate them a course where he can get them over land as quickly as possible so that when Biddick has to make his crash landing, he can do it, not over the ocean. So he has kind of a close call, but they have a little crash landing in Fraserburgh, Scotland, and everyone survives. And it's one of those moments where you're like, what a relief. That was very close.
Nothing's going to happen to this crew again.
Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, in connection with this, Crosby gets transferred to Blakely's crew full time, and it's sort of a promotion because Blakely's crew flies lead, which basically the way they had decided to do it at this point was that whoever was in the lead, it would be their navigator who was doing the primary navigating and everyone else would follow, and it would be their bombardier that would decide when to drop the bombs and everyone else would follow. So you had a lot of responsibility flying in the lead, and Harry doesn't think he's earned it. In his memoir, he talks about how he got commended for maintaining radio silence on the flight, but it's because he forgot to radio in because he was panicking so much. And he talks about how he got commended for radar evasion, but he was actually flying super low because he couldn't figure out where the fuck he was and he wanted to look at landmarks. And he talks about how he got commended for flying over Scotland instead of Norway like he was supposed to, but he did that because he was more familiar with Scotland than Norway, so he could map it better. So anyway, through this series of hilarious fumbles, he manages to get promoted, and he also gets recommended for his first medal, a Distinguished Flying Cross.
Incredible. Nobody's doing it like you, Harry Crosby.
So many things happened to him kind of by accident.
You know what, though? He finished his time in the Army. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was a well-respected group navigator. I do think that he's putting it on a little bit. He's like, oh, I didn't know how to do this. And it's like, bro, you probably did. And what especially makes me think that is because he doesn't really talk about the initial Brady incident. I think that one makes him feel embarrassed and shitty. And I feel like he's able to be self-deprecating about this stuff because it's like, he actually did kind of know what he was doing, though.
He's got a charm, which is why I think Anthony Boyle was such great casting. Because I bet if you put them two of them in the room together, they would have the same charm.
Yeah, exactly. Harry Crosby's memoir is great. Like, it's one of my top 5 war memoirs. He has a great sense of humor. And you can tell that, like, the man fucked. He did have some charisma.
So, after the mission, there is a dance at some point. Egan shows off his terrible singing. Douglas, who's one of my favorite side characters, makes a bet that he's going to make love one of the Red Cross girls named Helen, played by Emma Canning. And Diddy calls in from Scotland to let everyone know he's okay.
Which is my favourite gag in, I think, the entire series, where he yells down the phone that the Scottish like him because he's Irish. And then the Scottish guy is like, you're not Irish. But of course he is in real life. Oh my God. It's so funny. I don't know why. Every single time I crack up so badly.
It is funny. Yeah, and then we finish the episode. They're having a fun little bike race in the mess hall, but then the air raid sirens come on and spoil their fun. And they're by the air shelter and watching nearby Norwich get the shit bombed out of it. And at this time, they're kind of on the receiving end of the violence that they normally deal out.
I thought the bike race surely had to be made up, but that actually happened. I'm like, how? How do you do this shit on a base like that? But they did.
More importantly, how did they not kill all of their actors?
Yeah, it's just, they're indoors, and there's just so many of these grown men on bikes trying to bike around these like teeny tiny little hallways. I'm like, my gosh.
Also, not knowing how to bike because they're Americans.
That's so funny. Yeah, the English brakes were different on bikes. And there was a fantastic quote, something along the lines of the number of US airmen who came a cropper with the English braking system is the same number as the number of US airmen in England.
Episode 3. We open on a briefing for a bombing mission over Germany on August 17th, 1943, and the job they have to do is a double strike against aircraft factories in Regensburg and a ball bearing plant in Schweinfurt. So it's a double header. It's a tricky mission. The 100 are part of a huge task force that will hit Regensburg first, and then they will proceed to fly on to Algeria, while 2 other bomb groups hit the Schweinfurt target. The first one is kind of a distraction, and they're meant to confuse the enemy. But it will be, quote-unquote, the largest air armada ever assembled in the history of mankind.
I always laugh when they say stuff like that. I'm like, of course it's probably the largest air armada ever assembled. This is the they were okay. They did have fighter planes in World War I, but they didn't have anything on the scale like they did in World War II. So I'm like, yeah, man, you guys invented airplanes like 30 years ago. I'm not really surprised this is the largest air armada.
It's also such an obvious inspirational quote. Clearly, they're meant to hype these guys up. Because this mission is not without its danger, because even flying to Algeria is pretty tricky to get there. So it's like, good luck.
Yeah, and it super depends on timing. So the plan is that they're going to go up first, and then they're going to be followed within like 20 minutes by the other 2 groups. And the Germans are going to be like, oh, the Americans are hitting Regensburg, so they're going to go and get them. And then they'll see the Americans fly towards Africa and be like, what the fuck is happening? And while they're looking over there, then the other two task forces are going to hit Schweinfurt. And it's supposed to be a whole thing that prevents any one group from taking a huge amount of ass kicking. Spoiler alert, that's not what happens. But they kind of knew it was going to be a clusterfuck because Crosby flying lead had been pre-briefed, so he already knew about the mission. And so there was these two kind of lead teams that had been briefed, and one or the other was going to have to lead. And he wonders why the other team that had been in the top secret briefing isn't flying deputy lead. And someone says to him, the pilot's in the infirmary, and Cross says, I wish I were.
It's a shame that these secret briefings kind of aren't in the show. I would have liked to see them in the show because they're quite fun in Crosby's book.
Yeah, so the weather sucks because it's England and it's super foggy, and we see the guys, they're waiting to go up and they're all a little antsy. And we circle back on Bailey and Quinn, who we had met in the first episode, and we also meet William Babyface Hinton, played by Oakley Pendergast, and this will be relevant later in the episode.
Sad already, just like in anticipation of what's going to happen, I'm already sad.
You can't call a guy babyface and then expect good things.
Yeah, Babyface doesn't get to survive the war. There's not a chance.
There is a scene, I think it's in episode 2, where they're seen playing craps or a different game of cards, I don't know. But you see this actor and he looks like he's 12, like an actual child.
Yeah, I think because we're so used to seeing actors in their mid to late 20s or even older in a lot of these war shows, I think it's sometimes hard to remember how young they were. I used to teach, and looking at teenage boys, I'm like, even when they're 18, I'm like, that's not a grown man, that's a baby.
I mean, wasn't Egan sort of treated as quite an old man, all things considered, at the grand old age of 27?
Yeah.
So the 100th person of the task force ends up going up alone. The other crews are not going up because of the weather. And this obviously, Sam has already said it, it's got disastrous consequences. So the other two are 5 hours late, the other two task forces. And instead of having backup, they're out there all alone and the Germans can focus all their attention on our guys. They're up there all alone. It's really shit.
Yeah. And Gil Clevin has his big hero moment. There's a well-known story about him where his plane is absolutely shot to shit. And like really, any pilot with sense probably would have bailed out, but he decided he was not going to do that. And his co-pilot was basically begging him to let them bail out. And he was like, no, we're going to sit here and take it. And this was witnessed by Baron Lay Jr. of 12 O'Clock High fame. And you can go listen to our episode about 12 O'Clock High. And he wrote about it, and he actually recommended him for a Medal of Honor. Clevin received the Distinguished Service Cross instead, but he never collected it. He said something to the effect of, medal, I needed an aspirin. So, you know, some old man humor there.
This mission is bad. Curtis Biddick tries to land his damaged plane in order to save his wounded co-pilot, and the acting in the scene by Barry Keoghan is amazing. My favorite part of him acting, he's got this bravado right up until the very end, and there's this moment he crashes and his plane dips at the very end, and he says something like, oh god, but his face is amazingly acting is brilliant in this scene, but also so heartbreaking.
Yeah, this was also witnessed by Baron Lay Jr., which is probably why we know essentially what happened. But real Kurt was trapped in the cockpit by a fire while he was keeping the plane level for the rest of the crew to bail, and his co-pilot, Flight Officer Richard Snyder, did attempt to jump but didn't survive. And today, the bodies of Kurt Biddick, aerial engineer Sergeant Lawrence Godby, and Sergeant James Bear, who's an airman from another crew, have been repatriated. Unfortunately, after they were buried, it wasn't possible to separate out who was who, so they remain buried together in St. Louis, Missouri.
There's an article by Burnley Jr. called I Saw Regensburg Destroyed that he wrote for the Post, I believe. I don't remember, but I'll link it on the website.
Yeah, it's the Saturday Evening Post.
Exactly. And it's a very good read. Like, Burnley Jr. is a fantastic writer. If you think Kurt Biddick dying isn't bad enough, we get another one. We get the scene where Alice from Dallas is shot down. And it's the most horrific scene ever to be portrayed on television for me. When I first watched it, I don't know what happened to my body, but I went into full body sobs. I could not stop crying for the next 10 minutes because babyface Hinton gets stuck in his ball turret and Quinn tries to save him, but he can't do it, and he has to make the very difficult choice of leaving him behind to die in a plane, and it's just horrible. I do like the scene. It's really interesting because you also see Quinn, who's a navigator, eat all his mission logs before they bail. And that's how important it was to keep everything a secret. Just eating paper.
To me, this scene was one of the great examples in this show of everything that seems too overdramatic or crazy to have actually happened did actually happen, even if it didn't necessarily happen to that character. All of these stories, a lot of them come directly from the book Masters of the Air or from the other memoirs. It's that quote that's like, truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to be possible. This stuff just seems completely outrageous that it would have actually happened, but it did.
Burnley was supposed to fly with Alice from Dallas on this mission. I'm kind of glad he didn't, because instead he was put on Piccadilly Lily, which is another plane, because Cleven suggested to Kid that Alice's position in the formation was too out in the open and too dangerous, so they put him on Piccadilly Lily. And while Piccadilly Lily is not in the show as some of the other planes are, you can see it on the hard stands in one of the scenes. They do a little nod to it.
The planes that remain limp to North Africa on Crosby's directions. They're trying to find this airstrip in Algeria, and they're all extremely low on fuel, as you can imagine, so they don't have a lot of margin for error. They're jettisoning extra weight over the Mediterranean. They're throwing everything out. And by the time they get there, Buck Cleven has to make an engineless landing. They're basically just a glider at that point. There's this sort of tense bit where they have to wait until the very last minute to put the landing gear down to make sure that they can actually stick the landing. And yeah, the mood on the ground is pretty... Everyone is just reeling. You know, they're in total shock about how much of a shit show that was. And in the Miller book, he says the Regensburg mission was the most disastrous American air operation up to that time. 60 bombers and therefore 600 men were lost. The targets that they were hitting that day were protected by one of the most formidable aerial defense systems in the world. And of course, because it didn't go as planned, they left a lot of guys out in the open. And so there was quite significant casualties.
Yeah, man, just hearing about this mission on tour, it hit so hard how many men that is. 600 men on one day. It's crazy. That's the end of the episode, by the way. I think this episode is one of the hardest to watch. It's also the one I've probably seen the most, together with episode 5. So what did you guys think in general of the first 3 episodes?
My closing thoughts is one of the interesting things about Masters as a TV series is that a lot of the smaller roles are filled with people who have been around like the British drama circuit for either a really long time or in sort of quite significant roles. And I don't know if this hits different because I am a British person, but I recognize so many of the faces, which means that of the crews, as they sort of disappear one by one, you're losing recognizable faces. And I think both the series does that, where we get slight introductions to individual characters just to know who they are before we lose them. But also, like on a meta level, as an audience member, I don't trust that anyone's going to survive, even if I don't know the history. And I find that very unsettling. And I think that's very effective as well. And that's why it was so brilliant to cast Barry Keoghan in this role, is because, you know, his star is on the rise. You don't expect Barry Keoghan to die, but that's what the history did. And some of that is sort of lucky in hindsight because this was filmed way back. I think he was already known, but I think his star has risen in the last couple of years in such a huge way.
I think it's the same even for Austin Butler, because they filmed this right after Elvis, and Elvis was really his big mainstream break. And thankfully we get to have him around for a little bit longer than most characters. But so many of the people that you see in Masters are doing pretty well.
In case anyone was wondering, this show really made a big splash in the people who have already seen and enjoyed Band of Brothers in the Pacific community.
Yeah. However, this show is the most criticized out of all of them. And the one difference that this show has compared to the other two is that hardly any of the airmen were still alive when this was made. There weren't that many interviews done for this show as there were for band and even the Pacific. So it's a different kind of storytelling in that sense.
For
Yeah.
sure. Really conjuring up voices from beyond the grave. And I also think this sense of people who are not here anymore, we're less likely to accord them flaws. Like people die, and now that we're that one step removed from them, it's like a lot easier to make them into saints than it might be if you had like known them as real people, if that makes sense.
It's interesting if you go to the air bases in East Anglia and you talk to the people who run the museums and volunteer and things like that, because almost to a person, they will speak of the Americans in this very reverent fashion. And they're sort of talking about sort of protecting their memory and protecting their legacy. And if you think about it, what they got were these young men who came over, who stayed and lived within their communities. As you say, they were quite flashy. A lot of the kids at the time would be quite awed at these Americans who came in, and it was such a glamorous disruption in many ways. And then a lot of them, they would just disappear and they were never seen again. And then they left, but they left all of these marks of things that where they were left behind. And so it's like this strange echo of reverence where they never got to see them be whole, messy people. They never got to see them be old for whatever reason. Either that is because they died or because they were all over the way in America. You know, it's a really interesting experience.
We met one of the kids who lived near the airbase on the last tour that we went on. And he said when they left, there was a big emptiness in his life because he was 12 or 14 at the time, very young. Those were very formative years. And he had all these American pilot friends around and airmen around. And then they left and they were left alone, and the village was very sad about them leaving. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, to have these strange people from this other country that you can never speak to again because you don't have the internet. And then they're just gone.
So we'll be covering episodes 4 through 6 next week, and then we'll cover the last 3 episodes the week after. And in the meantime, that's it for us today. You can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can rate us 5 stars. You can send this episode to a friend. You can tell George they did a great job at being not just an SAS Rogue Heroes correspondent, and hopefully they'll come back for many more episodes. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website, rosietheReviewer.com. See you next week.
Thank you for listening.